Hey guys, it's Shaylin. I'm here today with another writing video. So today I'm doing a follow-up to a couple videos that I've done in the past, over the past couple years. It's just a series of rapid-fire short fiction tips. So I did the first part, I think back in 2020. It was called like 12 tips for new short story writers, and then there was a follow-up one that was like 15 tips for better short stories. Well, I've got 11 more for you here today. Those are two of my favorite videos I've ever made on my channel. I think they're some of the most helpful. These are not necessary components of every short story. The purpose of these tips isn't to say every short story should do all of these things. Especially with a short story, they're fairly short. It's a very compact form. So really, you're usually aiming to do one thing very, very well, not do a bunch of different things. This entire video series is more just a series of tips that I find I come back to when I'm stuck. You know, little light bulb moments, things that have helped me in the past, things that have clicked a story into place. Not to say that every story needs to do all of these things, because you will find so many and you will write stories that don't do these things, that don't do any of these things. These are not necessary components of a good short story. So the first tip here, it's less of a tip, it's more of a formula, and though I don't really believe in writing formulas, I do think sometimes that if there's a clear template that you can outline a form from, it can be helpful. So this is kind of, I think, a really good but basic way of seeing a short story and how the main components fit together. Conflict is a character who wants something. Plot is them trying to get that thing. Theme is why they want it or what we learn about them. I think that that's just like a good, clear way of seeing how the pieces fit together that I think is true of many different short stories. And I think it can just be good to have that basic template to come back to if you feel like you have the beginnings of a story but it's not really working. Kind of identifying, okay, well then what is my conflict? Okay, well the plot is going to progress based on the goal, and the central theme of the idea, if you're struggling to identify it, probably comes back to their goal. I did like a Q&A, a 3-part Q&A on short stories last year, and there were a lot of questions about theme, and I think that in short stories, the best way to see theme is not as a big, broad idea and not as a moral, but rather what you are saying about the character. And most of the time, it's the root of that thing comes back to why they want whatever they want. Tip number 2, bring back details you've introduced. This is a philosophy that some people hold, that like anything you describe, anything that is mentioned should essentially be a Chekhov's gun, right? Like if it's introduced into the story, it should have plot relevance. I don't really believe in that. Sometimes you describe something because you want a vivid sense of setting. And I think it becomes pretty obvious if you're only describing things that are plot relevant, because then the reader starts to realize, oh, well, if this is being described, it's going to be a plot point later on. I'm not of that mind, but I do think that in a short story, one way to create a sense of unity in a short piece, which is often the goal, and I think I've said this in past videos, that short stories are about unity because you have so few pieces, so every piece should be working together to create the whole. One of the best ways to do that is if you introduce a detail that feels it should be important, something significant, tie it back in the end. If you introduce, whether that's an object into the story or an important detail about your character, bringing that back full circle in the end can be super impactful, which leads to tip number 3, and it's just to tie all your threads together in the end if possible. One collection that does it really, really well is the collection Sabrina and Karina by Kelly Fiardo on Steam. She's really, really good at that, and she does that in pretty much all the stories in that collection, where there's 2 threads weave together, and then in the end of the story she brings them together. And you know, normally in a short story you have one main thread, but you might also have, say, an important detail that's introduced about a character, a habit of theirs, something that feels important to the character. Realizing now that a recurring theme in my work is characters who steal stuff. Like I had a short story where the main character steals mail, and I had another one where the main character has a habit of stealing the extra button from shirts from people's houses or from stores, like just keeping the extra buttons. I don't know why. Stealing stuff is interesting. So if you introduce that this main character also has some kind of specific stealing habit, and it's good to make that specific, something specific that they steal, if in the end all those things can come together, right? So if you can bring together the conflict, the internal conflict they have, the external conflict, but in this habit that they have that reveals something about them, how would all those things tie together? I can't really tell you off the top of my head, but I think that that's just a good way to break down the ending of your story. If you're stuck on the end, just step back and be like, okay, what have I introduced? What are all the threads I've introduced, all the details I've introduced? How can I tie them together so that one is used to reveal something about the other? Like, how can I use the stealing to reveal something about how the main character feels? I've talked in the past about how the ending of a short story is the answer to the question that the short story is posing. It's kind of something that feels inevitable. So the ending should answer that question, but if it can do that by bringing in all aspects of the story, maybe in an unexpected way, I think that that's very ideal, and every piece of the story feels like it's contributing something, and it can make a very satisfying ending. It's not easy to do, and I can't say I've successfully done this in every story I've ever written, but I think that if you can pull that type of ending together, it's really, really beautiful, and it just makes the story feel very well conceptualized and very intentional. Tip number 4 is to think about your story's symbolic equation. This kind of ties back to a video that I posted semi-recently that I'll leave a link to on the planes of conflict in a story, where I was talking about how a story kind of has 3 planes. The concrete plane, which is the concrete events that are happening, the internal plane, which is everything happening within the main character's mind and internal perception, and the symbolic or metaphorical plane, which is the themes, ideas, symbols, and metaphors being explored in the story. A really beautiful, cohesive story has a well-conceptualized and consistent symbolic equation, right? Where the things that are happening on the concrete plane add up together and they mean something on the metaphorical plane. I think a good way to kind of think about this is like breaking down how those planes reflect on each other, right? So you have the concrete events that are happening, and that kind of reflects onto the internal plane. So how does your main character interpret everything that's happening, and what can we learn about them through their interpretation of the concrete events? And then that reflects onto the metaphorical plane, right? What does everything mean symbolically? Is it consistent? So at the end of your story, if a certain series of events happen, when you move up to the internal plane, are those things aligned? So if something happens at the end of your story, does it say and reveal what you want to be said and revealed about the character internally? And does it align with the symbolic pieces that you've set up? If those things are all aligned, it's just kind of like a beautiful moment. Again, hard to write a story where this all ties together perfectly, and I can certainly say that this doesn't fit perfectly in every story I've ever written. But sometimes I think if there's a thematic disconnect in a story, it's because what's being said concretely doesn't align with what the story is trying to say thematically or symbolically. Asking yourself, what do I want to say thematically, symbolically, metaphorically, and is that actually what the story is saying? Very hard to explain, bit of a big brain moment. If you haven't seen my video on this topic, I'll just redirect you to that one because I go much more in depth on this topic. Tip number 5, surprise us. In a short story, something should surprise the reader at some point. Usually in a short story, the reader isn't reading for plot suspense in the same way as in a novel, right? In a novel, you have a long series of events and we want to know what's going to happen. Short stories don't really, in most cases, aren't as plot driven because there's not as much space to develop a compelling plot. They can be plot driven, but it's rarer because of the space limitation. We're reading for that moment of surprise, the magical ingredient of short fiction in a lot of ways. And I think that in a good short story, something needs to surprise us at some point. You know, something that the character does that's unexpected but makes sense. Surprise can be kind of a form of tension. It's just good to ask of a short story, like, what is surprising the reader in this story? And if nothing is surprising the reader, then the story could feel, honestly, for lack of a better word, bland. I think it's always good to ask that of your character too. What does the character do in this story that surprises the reader, but that still makes sense with their character? Some of the most incredible moments in short fiction is when a protagonist does something unexpected, but yet when it happens, we realize that it was inevitable. So if you feel like your story is missing that je ne sais quoi, I went so hard on the French accent there. My inner French immersion kid just became awakened. It might be because there isn't a moment of surprise. Tip number 6, use tone and voice as world building. You know, world building is often described as a sci-fi fantasy concept or even a historical fiction concept, but world building exists in every genre. It's just more subtle in a contemporary realist piece, but every single piece has world building in it. However, in short fiction, and this could be for speculative short fiction or for contemporary realistic short fiction, you don't have as much space on the page to world build like you would in a novel. And so one really valuable way to get more world building out of your piece is to use voice and tone as world building. A more realistic, grounded tone creates a different world than a more surreal, strange tone, right? If the voice and tone of the story is very bizarre and strange and surreal, that's actually doing world building. You're building that we're in a surreal world versus maybe a very contemporary, realistic, grounded world. And in that case, if something very bizarre or strange happened in a world where you've built up the voice to be grounded in, will feel very jarring. But it would make sense if the voice itself is created in a very surreal, bizarre, strange way. So you can use voice itself as world building. This also comes back to word choice. I was writing a historical fiction piece a few months ago, the first time I've ever written historical short fiction. The world building is pretty much only done through voice because there's no time to do it otherwise. So leaning into some historical voice, really carefully choosing my diction, using some historical diction, that's world building, right? Like, word choice is world building. If you're writing a fantasy piece, the words you use indicate what is present in the world. Word choice is drawn from the world that the story is set in, and so you can use word choice as world building. If you want to learn a little more about word choice, I have an entire video on word choice. Tip number 7. Give your character contrasting details, and then find a way to make it make sense. In a short story, a lot of the time, you're just trying to hone in on one very particular aspect of your protagonist. One of the main differences in character writing versus a novel versus a short story, let's say you're writing a character-driven novel, one might call that a character study, right? This is a deep unpacking of everything about this character, and so by the end we have a full portrait of this character, and there may be core things we're exploring about them, but we're in the novel aiming to get a full rounded understanding of this person. Whereas in a short story, we do want the character to feel like a full rounded person, but rather than unpacking their entire character, what we're doing is honing in on the most specific, interesting, compelling thing about them, finding something very crucial to reveal about that character. I think that's the key with a short story character, is that there's something very interesting, very particular or surprising that is being revealed about this character, and you really only need one thing. And I think one really good way to find that interesting thing to unpack about your character is to give them contrasting traits and then unpack how those things make sense together. People are contradictory. That's inherent. I think every living person has contradictions. They have qualities that contradict with actions they have taken, or they have, just contrasting personality traits that still make sense within them. People are very complex, and I think one of the biggest mistakes a writer can make is being so focused on the logic of character writing that they forget about the messiness. People are so messy and chaotic. Sometimes people don't make sense and people contradict each other. Everyone has contradictions within them. Sometimes if you can understand and capture that messiness and those contradictions, that is the best and most believable character writing, because it reflects what is true about us. Like, sometimes our worst behavior, our worst choices are manifested by our inability to reconcile two contradictory parts of us. So whether that's two contradictory traits or having your character want two opposing things, which usually if a character wants two opposing things, that's a manifestation of an internal thing about them, right? Like, if you can identify that contradiction and then use the story as a way to explain and unpack why that is and make it make sense and show to the reader why this contradiction exists, that can be very, very powerful. Tip number 9, link your images. In a short story, and I've said this several times, you want to create a sense of unity. There aren't going to be a lot of threads. Try to hone in on a very distinct pattern of visual imagery. In most stories, you want the story to have a consistent look, a consistent atmosphere, potentially only one setting. And even if there are multiple settings, they should still feel cohesive. So try to link your images and use cohesive threads of imagery. Images that fit together to create a cohesive mood and look. This can also be used to reveal something about your character. You know, for example, using a lot of naturalistic imagery. If you were to throw in some very unnaturalistic imagery into a story that otherwise has been set up to have very naturalistic imagery, I mean, that could be a great moment of surprise and contrast, but if not done intentionally, it could also kind of muddle the atmosphere you've created. This can be very subtle as well, not necessarily something the reader is going to pick up on. Reaching for images throughout that make sense together, and this can be a reflection of what the character fixates on, create symbol, atmosphere. It could also be a form of world building, but it's just that extra way to create cohesiveness in your story. So instead of every image, every line, every detail being good within that sentence, thinking about how they all work together to create a cohesive atmosphere and a cohesive thread of imagery throughout. Tip number 10, build causality paragraph to paragraph rather than scene to scene. So in a novel, we're often thinking about the causal chain of the story being scene to scene. So scene A causes scene B, causes scene C, causes scene D, all the way through, ideally. Hard to keep that up perfectly throughout a novel, but ideally, as close to that perfect causal chain as you can create is a strong plot. In a short story, I think that rather than seeing the causal chain being scene to scene, it's better to think of it paragraph to paragraph. You may only have a few scenes in your short story. As a result, that causality is actually happening on a micro level, even line to line. Paragraph to paragraph is a more manageable way to see it. But I think seeing it paragraph to paragraph is pretty manageable. What the character is feeling in this paragraph, leading to what they're feeling in this paragraph. You know, so even if it's something like, okay, something happens in this paragraph, which makes the character think about this, which makes them reflect on this, so we're going to get a little bit of backstory. That causal chain happening on a paragraph to paragraph basis can help you create a rising sense of escalating tension on that micro level, because on a short story, the plot is really shrunken down. The story beats are very, very micro. Something that is a key story beat in a short story could be the character thinking something, feeling something. A single paragraph of reflection can be a key story beat in a short story because the plot is so micro. Rather than thinking about causality scene to scene, I think it's actually more paragraph to paragraph in a short story. And tip number 11 is to earn your revelation. I've talked about this in pretty much every video I've ever done on short story, but I think that short stories are about revelation, right? So the end of a short story, something should be revealed about the character. It's often said that by the end of a short story, a character should change, but I don't know if I agree with that. I think by the end of a short story, something should be revealed about a character. Maybe they've changed, maybe something has just been revealed about them. Maybe they were given the opportunity to change and they don't take it. Maybe they haven't changed, but we've learned something about them. Maybe they have a revelation about themselves, but they choose not to act on it. It doesn't have to be about change, but I do think there should be revelation. But the key is that that revelation needs to be earned by the events. If that revelation were possible for the character to have at the beginning, it's not a unified thread of events. If you're thinking about how your plot should unfold or your story should end, think about what event or choice or series of events is going to force your character into that key moment of revelation, or force the story into that moment of revelation. Like, you know, ask yourself about your character, like, what am I trying to reveal about this character? What thing that could happen to them is going to force them to either face that within themselves, or is going to force that to be revealed about them, you know? I've talked multiple times throughout this video about different ways that a story can all tie together in the end. It depends on the story, right? Like, all of these different ways that you can view the end of a story clicking into place just depends on the story you're writing. But I think in general, I do like to think about revelation as being kind of like the magic ingredient of a story. What am I revealing about a character? What is being revealed about the character? And the ending of the story being the thing that forces that revelation. I'll leave a bunch of related videos that I've done. I know these were very quick fire tips and not all of them have examples. It's very hard to think of examples for some of these, and I know that examples help, when I think about my own education in writing, a lot of the time there was no example. Like, I was just, something was said offhandedly by a peer, by a prof. I realized it while editing a piece. It was a note in the margins of a workshop draft, and it was something that clicked for me, and there was no example. It was just an abstract piece of advice that I then had to look for in my own work, look for in the work that I was reading. These things are very abstract that it's very hard to think of an example that's not just restating the point, essentially. I have talked about a lot of these things and used more examples in other videos. I have a whole playlist of short fiction videos, so I'll leave that in the description as well. And really, my recommendation if you're learning to write short fiction or learning anything is to try and bring in the craft that you're learning into your reading. So if from this video or any other source you hear an interesting little bit of nugget of advice and you're like, oh, that was interesting, try to find it in what you read. Like, my biggest piece of advice if you want to improve your short fiction skills, go read, a short story a day for the next week, just in online magazines, there are endless of them. Or pick up like a Best American Short Stories or something. Try to do all different authors because different authors use different techniques in their work. And after each story, just like break it down. Look at the techniques that they use. Why was it effective? How did the pieces all work together? Do your own little dissection, your own little workshop. Draw it out. Draw a diagram. Write out all the scenes and write out like, okay, how did each scene tie together? How did they move together? Do a little mind map, write down like where was the exposition? Where was the backstory? That's a very helpful exercise, I think, to understanding how the pieces work and seeing it happen in real time, and you can do it with short stories that you enjoy. Like, do that with your favorite short stories, the ones that exemplify how you would like to write. If there's a short story that you read and you're like, oh, that worked, like, that's what I want to do, I wish I could write like that. Take an hour to break it down and really dissect the pieces and kind of be like, okay, this was the revelation, like, oh, this moment really surprised me, like, really break down all the pieces. And I think that that's one of the most valuable exercises that you can do to learn how to write a short story, especially if you repeat it and do it, several different times. So as much as I hope these videos are helpful, I'm also very cognizant of the fact that me just shouting craft at you isn't that helpful if it's not being applied, but I can't do the application for you. Obviously, if this was a class, we would have readings and we could discuss them and everything, but this isn't. This is just me talking at you on the internet. And so I think if you really are trying to learn how to write from internet craft videos or craft articles, it's really important to take that into active application. So I guess my recommended exercise for this video, if you want to kind of apply all these things, is to go break down a couple short stories. Actively write out that breakdown to have the story, maybe even print it, write all over it, maybe do a little notebook breakdown, whatever it is, and do that a few times to see the gears and how the gears fit together. Because a good short story is kind of like clockwork, right? Like, all the gears fit together, and then when you turn, it works. I think the best way to understand that is to just spend that time with short fiction and engage with it, and you'll learn a bunch of stuff beyond what I talked about, right? Like, you'll have your own revelations and find your own way of craft making sense for you. And I think that that's really important and probably the best way to learn how to write. So anyways, guys, that said, I guess my question would be if you want to leave a link to your favorite or just the name, because sometimes links get flagged as spam in the comments. But if you just want to mention your favorite short stories that are available to read online, for anyone who's maybe looking for some good reads, because I think that, again, reading a bunch of short stories is the best, and really reading them actively is the way to learn how to write short stories. So if anyone wants to leave some suggestions of just your favorite short story and maybe where it can be read, the magazine that it's in, I think that would be super, super helpful for everybody. All right, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video.